The title for today is Islamic Education, Philosophy, and Practice. This relatively basic presentation nonetheless lays down the core principles that should guide our practice as Muslims, parents, or educators. It is not a motivational talk, but hopefully the principles discussed are motivating for those who give them their due. There's no way to exaggerate the importance of getting the basics of Islamic education right. There's a bias towards the practical, or what we might call the pragmatic, that in what is now called Islamic education, teachers will say, I don't get it. Can you just give me a new starter activity for my lessons or a worksheet for the body of my lesson? So here the challenge comes to light that as second and third generation Muslims, in most cases, we're trained in a vocational and pragmatist education system. This calls for an intervention, especially as curriculum and the education system that surrounds it is partly, at least, reproductive system of a culture. In my own case, I've come to believe that when we come from a lack of Islam to seek the Islamic, we often fall into looking for a golden age in the past that has no connection to the present. But if one looks at the writings on the decline of Islamic learning, the century in which the so-called decline of the Islamic sciences actually occurred is pushed back from century to century to the point that it really is only in the last 100 years or so that one finds this decline. An implication of this is that the robust madrasa, unaffected by colonial imposition or a more ambient brain drain, have left a few models for us. And one may see that these true madrasas embody the theory of education that I'll put forward. And it's crucial that one not make the all too modernist error of trying to recreate an education system from pietistic imaginings, plus what we understand of Quran and Sunnah. The difference between that and what a living tradition actually embodies will be fatally different. Finally, to clarify for attendees what will and what will not be spoken of in this lecture, it will not address the difference between the liberal arts and what we call English language and literature, nor the difference between natural science and science, what we call science, nor even the crafts and what we call fine art. It suffices to note in passing that in general, the theoretical and instrumental sciences of the madrasa are liberal and humanist sciences, while not being merely liberal arts, that is, as an end in and of themselves, but rather that they're integrated into the truth claims of revelation, as well as the ends of revelation, to perfect the human being through knowing God, through knowing His signs, either in ourselves or in the world or in the horizons. So this is ultimately where knowledge is situated, when that knowledge is handled correctly. As a speaker who, in this case at least, was inspirational, not merely motivational, once said, don't condemn if you see a person has a dirty glass of water. Just show them the clean glass of water that you have. When they inspect it, you won't have to say that yours is better. I intend to implement this advice in this talk by positioning the philosophy of Islamic education instead of highlighting the issues in the modern misconceptions of this philosophy. Islamic education. By the end of this talk, I hope that you'll learn the basic philosophy behind Islamic education and that you start thinking about how you can implement it in your own context. And we can speak about that during the Q&A. Education is the reproductive system of a society. It determines what kind of person will be created by the education system. A practitioner needs to study Islamic education to empower their decision-making and their practice. They don't need to become articulate and literate regarding the ins and outs of an academic field of Islamic education. The aim of Islamic education is the aim of our deen and religion. The commands of our revelation aim to perfect the highest part of physical creation, namely humanity. That is the aim in the telos. And allow it, humanity, to return to and ascend to God, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Islamic education is the means of instilling Islam in learners. Thus, education here is used in the broad sense, including teaching, ta'lim, and character development, Tarbia. Sayyidina Qibl al-Atas and others have a single definition that encompasses both. So, Tarbia can be translated as upbringing or spiritual training. It may be defined as to help something, anything, really grow step by step towards its perfection. This is opposed to ta'lim, which is purely conceptual teaching. Let's say cognitive, i.e. conveying knowledge to others. Islamic education is thus aims to perfect the human being through bringing about the potential of their latent faculties inherent in the human soul, and which ultimately includes knowing God or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what is the philosophy of Islamic education, and where is it rooted? It is the principles and rationale upon which Islamic education is based. This includes the nature of the human being, the nature of knowledge, and the rationale behind the classification of the Islamic sciences, used in the broad sense as one would find in Kitab al-Ilm at the beginning of Ihya al-Madina of Imam al-Ghazali. As I'll mention later, if we start our division of the sciences by rational and religious or Islamic, we've already made a fatal mistake that removes the integration from our education, and you can see that represented both in our societies and in our so-called Islamic schools. Okay, so let's start with the nature of the human being. The nature of the human being is a spiritual being, enabled to act in this world through their embedded theoretical and practical faculties. This view is inspired by a dualist Quranic anthropology in which God first perfects the human body of Adam, balancing its temperaments, then blowing his own spirit into Adam, as well as teaching him the names and attributes of things. When I say dualist here, I don't mean a Cartesian dualism. I mean rather the sense that even the corporeal is informed matter and the form is immaterial. So it's really only a Cartesian world where the extramental world is just matter and extension without any incorporeal element in it, and that is an utter dualism. So this is different. So that reference there is to Quran 15:39 and 2:31. This anthropology rooted in the Quran, and which Imam al-Ghazali and others explain, you can see in Mizan al-Amal. I'm still not sure if that's translated entirely, but this indicates the human uniqueness, or what is unique of the human being, the capacity to conceive of and act on both realms, the corporeal and the incorporeal. As Ibn Khaldun states, it should be known that God distinguished man from all the other animals by an ability to think, which he made the beginning of human perfection and the end of man's noble superiority over existing things. Thinking can be viewed as a process of gaining knowledge, and ultimately, though, this faculty, when it's perfected, is the end. There's a big difference between the cogitative mode of gaining a knowledge of things and the resultant intuition. One of them is just a movement. And this really is what modern rationality focuses on, which is the instrumental intellect, and is utterly different from what we call scientia. That's a side note, in case it's OHT, as they call it, overhead transmission. So, the ability to think has several degrees. The first degree is man's intellectual understanding of the things that exist in the outside world in a natural or arbitrary, conventional wada'an order. This we may call observation or sense perception. The second degree is the ability to think, which provides man with the ideas and the etiquettes needed in dealing with his fellow man, and this is the practical intellect. The third degree is the ability to think, which provides the knowledge or theoretical knowledge or speculative knowledge of an object beyond sense perception without any practical activity going with it. This is the speculative intellect, al-aql al-nadari. I'm tempted to go into some of the misconceptions that occur with how we know things that are not sensible, which are the natures of things, because this really is perhaps the central issue in modern philosophy, that it denies that we can make sound inference from sense experience into the natures of things, and this leads to the split between subject and object. It leads to the split between fact and value, that you can't build a system in which you can have the good as something, immaterial values, if you're claiming that you can't know it in a post-Kantian world. There's time for things of this matter in the Q&A. Now, in Islamic education, the notion of the perfect human is based on the fact that the human being is composed of, as said, a theoretical intellect and a practical intellect. Perfecting these faculties means to develop them to the point of completion. We do typically get hung up as modern educated people on this word perfection. We think either of a face with no blemishes, which is really almost something which is impossible. If we think of perfect knowledge, we imagine that it has to be infinite, which again is impossible. As embodied beings, we can't really be perfect. So what we have to think about rather is that each type of being it's either created perfect, like an angel or a rock, or it is something more like tree, animal, or human that needs nurture, husbandry. It needs care to take it to its perfection, but that perfection is somehow natural to it. So this is part of the unlearning of modern errors that are typical, which prevent us from seeing how the natural world and perfection actually exists and operates in it. And just to note that this is one of the whole points of revelation, that Allah, as is mentioned in Juz Amma in more than one place, I believe, creates and then guides. So there are two commands that come down from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One is to give things being, to say to it be, and it is. But the second is to follow that with an instructor's manual which says to the beings that are rational, if you implement this and this and this and this and this, it's going to lead to your perfection both as an individual and as a society. And that is the greater meaning of the Sharia as the watering hole that we go to. It is not merely a law, and it surely isn't just a code. It is, if we say it's a way of life, that phrase can become rather cliched and empty if we don't know how to unpack that it really is a way of life. Okay, so perfection of the practical intellect. How? What is the means here? It's through removing vices and obtaining virtues. And the theoretical intellect is perfected through removing ignorance and delusion, wahm, and learning the proper sciences. As someone once remarked to me, the human mind tends to almost necessarily have a delusion about every topic. So whatever we don't study, we don't look into the science for that particular part of the practical world or theoretical world, the mind will fill in its own opinions, its own impressions. And the only way to remove that is to know at least the basics of that science. The model for the perfect man is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. According to an alternative view, the perfect human is achieved through the level of ihsan, spiritual excellence, rather than the perfection of the two faculties that were mentioned, in reality, there's not a dichotomy between these two views. They can be joined with each other. So reconciling them is not difficult, and the perfection of these latent faculties, when properly understood, is a means to spiritual excellence. As Imam Fakhruddin Razi explained in his amazing tafsir, the Quran ascribed perfection to the Prophet's practical faculty in Surah Al-Qalam. Surely you have a sublime character, and ascribed perfection to the Prophet's theoretical faculty in Surah An-Nisa. Allah teaches you that which you knew not. The grace of Allah towards you, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, has been sublime. So Razi concludes that the perfection of these faculties perfect the soul such that it resembles the angels. And that is what's going on in proper education. And what an enormous difference between an education that does that and an education which is merely vocational, which deserves to be termed instruction rather than proper teaching and upbringing. Now, Islamic education conveying knowledge requires another basic concept to become intelligible, and that is the nature of knowledge, in order for us to conceive properly of what we're doing here. And a typical teacher's activity would be to ask the learners, what do you consider to be knowledge? And you'll find that people will answer you memorization, performing well on a test. Someone else might have picked something up from somewhere and say, oh, knowledge is light, or something of the sort. So we have different conceptions of knowledge, and they actually inform the learner. And so in the teaching process, one has to address the learner and their vision of what is knowledge to really transform education. It's very easy for education to turn into performance, where people are trying to say the right answer, and that literally is phenomenologically what's going on in their mind. That's what they're doing. So we have to be reflective here and ascend in order to raise education to what it is supposed to be. So in Islamic education, knowledge is a quality, meaning that what we intend is to build a firm disposition, a Melaka, to know. I'm going to be speaking about that shortly. What is a Melaka? What is a disposition? So knowledge, character traits, and spiritual states can be two ways. One is a transient state, or a firm and stable state. So one is a hal in Arabic, the other is a Melaka. The aim of both education and Tarbia, moral and spiritual training, is to form a disposition, not merely a state. So Ibn Khaldun states, disposition is different from understanding and knowing by memory. Understanding of a single problem in a single discipline may be found equally in someone well-versed in the particular discipline and in the beginner, in the common man who has no scientific knowledge whatever, and in the accomplished scholar. Disposition, on the other hand, belongs solely and exclusively to the scholar or the person well-versed in scientific disciplines. This shows that scientific disposition is categorically different from mere understanding. A skill, versatility, and mastery of a science are solely the result of a disposition enabling its possessor to comprehend its principles and rules, and to understand its problems, and to derive its individual claims from its bases, to know that science from its bases all the way up, in order for it to be termed knowledge and understanding. But then the disposition is to be able to do all of that in a way that it is stable and firm. So we see that how the nature of knowledge is based on the nature of the Islamic and classical conception of the human being as well. Presently, we shall see that the rationale behind the classification of the Islamic sciences as things are in themselves, fi nafs al-amr, is also based on our conception of the human being. Okay, so we turn to the rationale behind the classification of the Islamic sciences. So we know what knowledge is now, and we know that it has qualities and levels, and that the disposition is really what is aimed for in a learner, not to make binge learning, which is designed for tests, where one regurgitates what one knows is required and then simply moves on, and that the demonstration of one's knowledge is sort of sparky hyperlinking from topic, that one can articulate certain relations between concepts and see them and state it as you're seeing it, but then if someone asks you 48 hours later or 3 months later, there's no trace of that. So not only is there a difference in that in the classical learning, one attempts to understand the essences of things, the quiddities of things. And this is the unchanging part of knowledge. There's a BBC radio show on the history of mathematics, and someone said that with the move from Greek geometry and mathematics in general into the modern, you have a sort of Faustian exchange where you're handing in eternal truths for calculus, which is made to optimize equations and to trace phenomena over time and sort of predict where it will be. But what is it? We don't know. That's the exchange. We lose the what is it. We just know how to correlate the movements of things and bodies over time, moving through space, and we sort of accept that there really isn't any other knowledge. I wouldn't want to disappoint you after the Imam said that we would speak about some of those things, in spite of the introduction where I said I basically wouldn't. So what is the full traditional syllabus? Within our tradition, there are several classifications based on several considerations, i'tibarat and haythiyat. But the best manner to classify the sciences accords with the following two principles. First, the realities of things in the world ontologically and how their realities logically relate to each other, giving a natural, logical order between the sciences that study those things. Second, that a classification leads unto the perfection of the human theoretical and practical faculties. As such, you would hear our scholars speak about three classes of the sciences: the theoretical sciences such as philosophy, theology, natural science, and mathematics, and the practical sciences such as Islamic law, ethics, the instrumental sciences, third category, so theoretical, practical, and instrumental. The instrumental, those sciences which aid the scholarly production of the theoretical and the practical sciences. So they're an aid to both of the other two, these three. And then a fourth is the productive sciences, or the arts, the sina'at. And the instrumental sciences are what we might term the trivium. And these are sometimes identified with liberal education. And as Sheikh Amin Khalwadia once mentioned, this is to have a trivium that really needs a quadrivium. You need something to study, otherwise you have the tools and you have nothing to study. You might describe contemporary education as the opposite of that, which is that you're given the facts, but you're not given the tools, the lost tools of learning and the trivium that you would need in order to understand those facts at the level that we call like a Melaka, a proper disposition. You're not able to really grasp them and know them from the roots up. So to illustrate how the four types of subjects work together and build a full Islamic curriculum and a sound and balanced culture, they really go together. I'll paraphrase a brilliant passage from Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, the section on education, ta'lim. The human being starts with no knowledge, and then obtains the discerning intellect, which is not far from sense experience, i.e. is very mundane and concrete. This type of knowledge is the source of order of an individual's movements, but it also enables them to earn a livelihood. These are the arts, sina'at. These arts include what Al-Ghazali refers to as the necessary and fundamental arts, branching off from the basic human needs for food, clothing, and shelter. These are the trades of the proverbial butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, but also the tailor, the carpenter, and the stonemason. Then these fundamental arts require tools, and hence the smith and forger emerge. And they all require courts and governance. But courts, weights, and currencies, and some management relate to the arts of yet another class of arts, or tradesmen, which are a ruler, a scribe, courtier, judge, paralegal, etc. At this level, these roles begin to require the practical sciences. The knowledge of the productive sciences is not enough. And I'd like to point out that this way of viewing society, A, it has an aim, which is the perfection of the human being, and B, it provides for everything that is needed, and C, it is not ideological. You're not being sold into someone else's interests, such as the leadership trying to convince you that globalism is better for you and for everyone else. This is an example of ideology. When you don't have a system that's built from the ground up and conveys to you how to take care of the aspects of society and culture from the ground up, the alternative is ideology. So there is between the trades and politics a shift from the productive to the practical. With it, we move from the first degree of intellect, the so-called discriminatory intellect, to the second degree, the experiential intellect. Ibn Khaldun sets aside the third chapter of the section on education to the experiential intellect and how it is brought about. He relates this division of knowledge to the statement of the philosopher, the human being is by nature a social being. Ibn Khaldun then focuses in his description of the experiential sciences on politics, one of three traditional practical sciences. They are traditionally, the three practical sciences, ethics, management of one's own faculties; home economics, management of those living in the same home, one unit of living, as it were; and politics, management of the city-state and those sharing with one in it. The knowledge of these matters occupies an important human faculty, but a faculty yet below the speculative intellect, i.e. the practical intellect. However, these sciences take their end as the speculative intellect and the speculative sciences. How? And at the same time, they require a necessary prerequisite to properly understand the speculative sciences. These are all necessary truths, which I'll be explaining in just a moment here. So the speculative sciences are alone the ultimate end, as they lead to knowledge of God and felicity in the afterlife. But we see here that for a healthy culture, that the practical sciences have the theoretical sciences as their basis. Why is that so crucial? The opposite of this is effectively pragmatism. This is a word which may not resonate with us, and yet we are living in a pragmatist world. As someone once pointed out to me, we are subjects of the modern state in a way that we also don't have the attention span to unpack and go backwards and see our own formation as a subject. So this topic is very important, and it behooves us to pay attention, that we can sort of see a way out of, just to use the pop culture term, the matrix, and see that we are indeed formed into being a subject to a culture which doesn't take perfection of the human being as its end. And knowing how to build up a culture from scratch is freedom immediately. One then understands, what do I need? What do my children need? What does my family need? What do I have to deliver in a curriculum? So when we say pragmatism, pragmatist practical sciences like contemporary social sciences have little to say about values and the prescriptive. While they're often proud of this, the result is that they focus on statistics used largely by the holders of power, the state, for its own end. So we can call this the Bonapartite or the Napoleon state that we live in. And again, we don't know that. We're not generally aware of that, even though it's needed to operate as a morally responsible agent. So it takes itself as an end, the state, to increase its economic muscles so that it can increase its military and political muscles, rather than aiming to perfect the human beings which make up that society. So also there's literally no goal. A goal should really be a value, and values are not pragmatic nor empirically tangible. You can't point to love, you can't point to unity, you can't point to social cohesion, you can't point to perfection of the human being. They're all things which are a meaning, which we have to grasp with our minds or receive through revelation. So when we say there's no goal, where one is invoked, it's in a pragmatist framework. It will tend to be utilitarian, centering on growth or at best physical pleasure, which, whether intended or not, leads to a culture catering exclusively for the material perfections of the human being, and it leads to hedonism. There are plenty of reports out about the fact that typical British children are more concerned about football and celebrities and their physical image than anything else. It really does dominate practically because they haven't been educated out of that. They haven't been liberated properly. So the practical sciences take the speculative sciences as their end, in the sense that determining what is good management of wealth is based on its end, which is to fulfill lower needs related to the dunya in order to achieve the virtues benefiting the soul in the afterlife. So we can imagine a political order where people are judged based on bringing about individual human perfection in that society. It would be something quite foreign. So this matter is amply explained by Al-Ghazali in his Ihya, which I've written on elsewhere, but at the same time they contribute to the speculative sciences through achieving the reform, islah, of the practical parts of the soul, which only occurs when one engages in good acts as to the point that these acts become virtuous habits of the soul. So in other words, the theoretical faculty can really only grasp realities after a person has removed the rule of the appetite and the desires and the vices over the soul. That's really only when we can trust our minds. The speculative sciences are the ultimate end and perfection of human development, and thus character and intellectual virtue are the aim of this philosophy of Islamic education. So we start to take a turn towards the practical here. What is the pedagogy of Islamic education? And arguably as well, it's universal enough in that it's based on these human principles that it should not be something for a special small class of students. It really, the human essence and being calls for this in its nature. And so putting something else in its place is effectively a missed opportunity. I mean, to spell it out really, sending one's children off to the local school, you have to ask, are they really having an education there which is perfecting their character and their intellect and their heart, or is it not? What is this and what is that, and are they the same or are they not? What is the missed opportunity that occurs when the children are there 8, 9 hours a day or longer and longer as the years go by? Every year that goes by, the extracurricular classes go longer and longer into the evening, and the expectations and the needs to focus in certain areas to get through examinations. This term pedagogy here for the Islamic education, the Arabic for it is uslub at-tadris. And this term, uslub at-tadris, occurs far rarer than one might expect. A teacher looks mostly in vain for a description of the structure of a lesson, and the standard manuals on teaching and learning that have become known in the nascent English language discipline of Islamic education are limited to adab and matters that, first, are highly general, such as the note to question students as to whether they have understood, which is common sense, really, and B, they do not represent what has become standard practice in the later classical madrasa. Ibn Khaldun explains that learning taking place through this active munadhara, debate and argumentation, gives the results in 5 to 7 years that learning through memorization brings about in 12. And he's speaking on the experience of North Africa and across the Islamic world in his time. The late classical syllabus then identifies itself in its crucial forms as the minhaj at-tahqiq, the method of realization. And that really means to move away from imitation and memorization to knowing. An example is in the science of fiqh, or Islamic law. One can memorize the rulings, but not be able to derive them. Pure memorization is only loosely termed fiqh. The fiqh, which is the careful understanding, should really be able to produce that ruling from Scripture with proofs. If one doesn't know how to do that, then this is only arguably fiqh. And the same applies to all of the sciences. Their conclusions should be conclusions, not premises memorized, if that makes sense. So the late classical syllabus identifies itself as the minhaj at-tahqiq, verification, not memorization. And its method of instruction is deploying bahth and munadhara, the science of we could call it research methodology and debate, which is the peak of the trivium in that it uses all of the other trivium sciences, which have been termed of late the lost tools of learning. Presently, I'll only give you a taste of what this pedagogy looks like in our tradition so that you may realize the usefulness and enduring quality of this Islamic syllabus, which in a way I'm arguing is superior to a classics training or a mere liberal arts training, which is not pieced together in a way that caters to the whole of reality and the whole of the human being. So the heart of the matter is that the instrumental sciences referred to as the trivium in wider classical studies are actively developed in both the learning and teaching of the sciences they are ordered to, as a means is ordered to its end. In other words, one uses grammar, rhetoric, and logic to properly learn the practical and theoretical sciences. Pedagogy is a manner by which the teacher raises the student up to the desired level of knowledge, which we said is the Melaka. It's this firm disposition where they really grasp it, they can reconstruct it on their own. In the madrasa, this level is obtaining a Melaka in a given science, and the sciences need to be chosen, as Imam Ghazali shows in Kitab al-Ilm, that one has to look at what is the priority of these sciences. These are basics that really should be taught, and that we have to take ourselves to task for coming to know and learning and spreading in the culture and society that we want to live in and that we want our children to live in. So this Melaka is obtained through the pedagogy that we'll speak about, through 3 matters. And these are the sine qua non of the classical syllabus and obtaining this real knowledge. So first, a set of what we may term study habits, because they fall outside of the lesson, but make the lesson possible. And second is what we'll term the gradual method, which again is outside the lesson, determining the order of the texts in a manner that allows the student not only to engage inside the lesson properly, but to retain the topics as a disposition, not mere transient understanding. And C, and finally, the engagement of the pedagogical text inside the lesson. So it is this combination of study habits, curricular order, and engaging the pedagogical text with the tools of learning that lead to the desired disposition. And these methods alone, arguably, would love to hear other opinions. So there's also the matter of the logical organization of the subject matter of sciences that is important, but this is a technical topic that we won't be addressing today. So to begin with, the complementary study habits that are crucial for students to adopt, these are study habits occurring some before and some after the lesson. Those which occur before are pre-reading, mutala'a, careful reading of the learning materials, including thinking through the grammar of the sentences, preparing questions, etc. Those which occur after are independent and group review. Takrar literally means repetition. So at the very least, to go over the lesson. There are German studies of memory acquisition that scientifically underpin this, but these people knew from practice what actually works, and that's why they implemented it. And mudhakara, for the students to mutually sit down, maybe 2, max 3, 4, so that they're active and recount their lessons and effectively teach it and reproduce the proofs for the conclusions that are in the text, something that sounds relatively foreign to many of us, is absolutely essential. So these two should happen the same day as the lesson, not merely before an examination. Memorization of texts is another method contributing to learning. It may occur before or after the lesson and is significantly important for certain subjects, such as memorizing technical definitions of a given subject. The gradual method is a second condition of bringing about the desired disposition, and it consists in ordering the texts in the curriculum from beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Without practically memorizing the basic text, setting out the main topics of their definition, and arguably even the beginner texts should be classical texts that are produced by real scholars of the highest caliber. So this is something that we see across the Islamic world, even in many traditional schools where the classical text is seen as too difficult. And I believe the reason that they often think that it's too difficult is because they're breaking the principles themselves by exposing the students to too many lessons at a time. This method I've seen. I spent 2 years in Konya, and I visited in Turkey and visited other schools and watched how it works. And many of the students coming in are not gifted like so many other places. They are those who couldn't get into medical school and whatnot, and yet they still come through this with incredible knowledge, incredible faculties if they stick it out. So the initial text has to practically be memorized. And that basic text should set out the main topics such that it's a map. It almost becomes like a card where one can see the map, like a thumbnail sketch, with the definitions of that science. Later engagement of proofs, without that, later engagement with proofs and counterproofs result only in so much dust being raised into the air and never settling. These levels go back to Imam al-Ghazali, and they and their role are described with additional nuances in Ibn Khaldun, and in Arabic it's iqtisar, iqtisad, and istiqsa. Minimal sufficiency, mapping the subject and its key terms, moderation, thorough, and finally thorough examination of the higher questions and debates in the field of the given text. One can derive from the levels that there are qualitative descriptions of levels of development and engagement. And finally, for the pedagogy, we come to the mode of handling the pedagogical text. So when one has a classical text in front of one, how does one engage with it properly? This is where the application of the lost tools of learning generally to the text is explained. This is not only for classical texts and, for instance, fiqh. Rather, these could be deployed with alterations as a classical method for active reading from a relatively young age, as well as for your own reading. So Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book is in this vein. But there's an existing related science, Adab al-Mutala'a, which is nearly identical to these methods, but designed for private perusal of a library or a given writing worthy of this level of attention, which would typically be a classical text. The following description then is derived from the Imam Shah Wali Allah Dehlawi in his treatise Al-Qawl al-Jamil. So he states that several things must be minded in teaching. And I'd argue that what's about to follow is really missing in many of the English-speaking manuals that explain Islamic education, which means that they seemingly haven't tapped into the classical sources that are actually being used in the late classical madrasa. Shah Waliullah states, first of all, what must happen when engaging with a text, explaining rare lexical terms and difficult or obscure matters of grammar. So, first of all, get the meaning very clear in the mind. Secondly, offering guidelines, and I mean linguistic meaning, offering guidelines for how to understand the problems, masail, or topics, through helping the student conceive them through concrete examples and clarifying their upshot. What is the basic claim that's being made? Have this very clear. And third, bringing proofs closer to comprehension. So after we have the claim, we turn to the proof. The term proof has almost dropped from modern vocabulary. Instead, we typically talk about evidence. Why? Because we live in a world that sees knowledge as contingent and probabilistic because of its own mode of knowing and exploration. That's a product of it. Now, so number three, then, bringing proofs closer to comprehension by explaining how they lead to their conclusions through suitable and ordered premises. The proper order gives you the form of reasoning that brings you to your conclusion, the entailment. Clarifying the benefit of, fourth, clarifying the benefit of certain restrictive phrases in definitions and universal precepts of a science, and the manner in which certain divisions exhaust or do not exhaust the items that they're claiming to divide. So they detail the roadmap of the subject matter of the text. And again, we're not trained to define, but a number of activities that are fantastic for learning and coming back to things and their essences occur through training people and testing them with a definition. Why is this word in the definition? What happens if we take it out and put another one in? Number five, dispelling superficial confusions such as how to distinguish between matters which are different but appear the same, or matters which are the same but appear different. Very commonly as well to note when there's a difference of opinion between scholars, that is this a linguistic difference of opinion, or are they actually making irresolvably different truth claims? Training the mind to see through this. And those differences and lacks of clarity are sometimes between two schools of thought or two opinions inside of a given school of thought. Number six, spelling out the proper way to construct definitions. What is allowed and not allowed in definitions. Also, how to properly construct proofs, barahin, such as the conditions of the premises leading to conclusions. This is to examine whether the text in hand fulfill these conditions of knowledge. And seventh, spelling out the rational tools employed by the text, such as if a matter either breaks the rules of entailment or contradicts a phrase written elsewhere in the text or misinterpreting word of one of the great imams. Dihlawi then remarks, the benefit of a scholar is not complete until they clarify these matters for their students and then remind them of them in their lessons. This is a universal claim. Again, we have to ask, is it occurring in our own education systems? So here we have a dynamic learning method for bringing a text to life through unearthing its linguistic and then its logical structure, then its knowledge claims, as well as its place within the wider field. Crucially, this is the learning method which leads to a disposition, Melaka, not mere transient understanding, as explained earlier by Ibn Khaldun. So what is Tarbia? Commonly said that Islamic education is two wings. And I often feel a bit of discontent when I use this word Islamic, right? But in a sense, it really is just education. And it deserves to be called that rather than what's often in its place. But let's turn quickly to this other wing of Tarbia. And this is to give an empowering but brief overview, both for practitioners and some of these are relevant to ourselves, of course. So we defined Tarbia earlier as helping something grow step by step towards its perfection. This is actually linked to the word Rabb, Lord, in the Quran. So in the Fatiha, when we say Rabb al-Alameen, that is the notion there, one of the notions that we can ascribe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he's described himself that way. So if Tarbiyah is used in the broad sense, it includes education, as said. In its narrower sense, it's used as opposed to education. So this is common with the word Islam, for instance. It can mean just the practice, or it can mean the whole religion. So we have to train ourselves to grasp that these words can have these two meanings. It's the same with Tarbiyah here. So in which case it means some or all of the following: conveying good habits, moral training, and purification of the heart, tazkiyah. In the narrower sense, Tarbiyah relates to the practical faculty, while teaching relates to the theoretical faculty, if we use Tarbiyah on that narrower sense. So as this topic is wide, what follows is a simplification for teachers performing the role of murabbi. And there's an argument that every teacher should be a murabbi, and if one is a parent, then one is a teacher. If one is a teacher, then one should be a murabbi. So that requires knowing how to do that task, which one will be asked about Yawm al-Qiyamah. So I've gathered the principles of this method from several sources, including Imam al-Ghazali and Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudah's book on prophetic Tarbiyah. In general, the Tarbiyah of the heart and character centers around the practical faculty. Character traits are habits in which, once obtained, this is a definition, actions flow without deliberation and without artificiality and great habit. The general method for changing character is as follows: identify one's virtues and vices, or natural disposition in the case of a child. Select the next appropriate virtue to seek, and understand what good actions follow naturally from the virtue that we're intending or aiming for. Then repeat good actions until a habit is formed. One may apply this to vices, identifying evil actions entailed by the vice, and perform the opposite of them until a habit is formed. In this manner, the heart is molded like a sculpture along virtuous lines. And what more important activity can we use the few decades that we're graced to walk on this sphere towards than taking this task on ourselves of making a sculpture out of our soul. So in addition to this general method, there's the overarching prophetic wisdom which should be minded if one is to be successful in the project of polishing one's own sculpture or in helping others as a murabbi. So these are prophetic wisdoms that help accomplish this below the activities that are directed best to different learners that are in different stages of moral development will be mentioned quickly. So focus on one habit at a time. When it is firm, then move to another. One way of knowing if it's firm, which is also a prophetic practice, is that it becomes easier to perform than to leave a good habit. So for instance, praying sunnahs can be harder to leave than to do for some people. For other people, it's harder to do than to leave. That's your criterion jumping up right there in your heart, but it requires being present to it and noticing it. And third, do little with consistency rather than great efforts for short, inconsistent periods. For example, read a little Quran each day rather than trying to read 60 pages on Friday, Yom al-Jum'ah. And finally, have a daily wird. Take oneself to task for completing some daily amount of worship and recitation, and things become a habit. And the prophetic practices, they are all medicines which, when applied to the soul, regularly heal it. But it takes mobilizing it in the way described. If someone is purely internally motivated, they should go out and learn the arguments that are set out by Imam al-Ghazali in his book Mizan al-Amal, which is said to be the blueprint of the Ihya Ulumuddin. So be able to construct the argument for how praxis leads to felicity in the afterlife. This argument is made through understanding that the human soul is composed of faculties, notably the intellect, the irascible faculty, which we can call anger, and the appetitive faculty, or desire. The practical faculty sits between them, and vice represents the lower faculties dominating the higher. They're giving the commands instead of the intellect and the sharia, as Imam al-Ghazali will say. So we have to look, where is the command coming from? This prevents the intellect from its role of receiving truths from above. Those truths, however, are the proper perfection of the intellect, and they bring about its partial felicity in this world and its more complete felicity in the next world. So the method of removing vice and gaining virtue is the method to felicity. There is really no other way. And just to give the titles here, understanding and enticing and warning, targhib and tarhib. This only works for someone who is already accepting and taken on board and identifying with the basics of belief. So we have to be aware that many of our children are not in that mode because of the habits that they've picked up. Fourth, the internalization of values. Fifth, taking a role model. Citing the Quran here, there are more Quranic verses on this as well, though, but if you were harsh and hard-hearted, they would disperse from around you. So to be a role model, and it requires an inclination of the heart of the young person. Now, number 6, whether that inclination happens or not, there is a modeling of character that happens. So whenever children, even before they're able to speak, see the way that adults behave, it's imprinting in their imagination, and it will come out on their limbs whether they like it or not. Number 7, rationalizing. So the prophetic model here is that a youth comes to the Prophet Muhammad and says, I want to fornicate. And the Prophet Muhammad tells him that, would you like this for your sister? Would you like this for your mother? And basically does not, he's perceptive that this person doesn't have the basics of adab and iman and akhlaq and other Islamic characteristics, but rather than becoming angered and seeing this person as having affronted him, the Prophet Muhammad sees what is in his best interest and rather lowers his level of discourse and speaks to him in a language he can understand. And finally, external rewards and punishments. Okay, so this is a lot of what goes on in schools with things like stars and golden time and threats and punishments such as detention, right? It can be helpful, right? Law is, in a traditional view of law, which is very different from a modern positivistic view of law, is that it encourages virtue if it's developed correctly. You know, we don't really think about it that way. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to use our few years on this earth for what is highest priority, and He's told us that the one who is victorious is the one who purifies the self. So we ask Him that for ourselves and our community, that in spite of the historical circumstances that we're in, that we do not continue to take the standards of success from those around us and from those who have perhaps politically defeated certain lands in the past. We ask that we take our standards of success from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and from the sound intellect and from the universal truths that are implanted in the human being by nature, and we ask that at the very least that we be in a position to be spokespeople of the ethical truth if we don't have other reins in our hand, if certain other things are out of our power. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires us with the taqwa to take care of our own closest to us that are an amana upon us, and that our entrance into Jannah is through them, and to allow us to seek the knowledge and means that we need to implement this role and to take this role more seriously than merely focusing on 11+ exams and our own careers and CV and the other elements which have entirely consumed many of us, perhaps through little fault of our own, but we ask Allah to have mercy on us before we die and after we die. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Thank you for your attentiveness.